The October Revolution of 1917 led to Russia withdrawing from World War I, so why was there still an American army fighting on Russian soil in 1920? Following Nicholas II's abdication of the throne, the Romanov family was moved into exile, ultimately ending up in Yekaterinburg at a boarded-up building known as the House of Special Purpose. There, the family waited in a strange limbo, imprisoned by revolutionary members of the Bolshevik Red Army while the world decided their fate. On the morning of July 17, 1918, with the White Army approaching Yekaterinburg, their captors took action. The family was led into the basement of the house where they were met by a firing squad and were executed at gunpoint. The true horror is in the details. The Romanovs had sewn jewelry and diamonds into their clothes, and doing so had effectively made the children bulletproof. Ultimately, the executioners relied on ruthless stabbings with knives and bayonets or shots to the head. The massacre took an agonizing 20 minutes to complete. Then, when it came time to hide the bodies, the leader was committed to rendering them unrecognizable, smashing in the skulls with rifle butts and burning them with sulfuric acid and gasoline before hiding them in unmarked graves. The last of their remains weren't discovered until 2007.
The bones were found in a forest near where the rest of the family remains were discovered in 1991.
The Bolsheviks officially sponsored widespread violence with a policy known as the Red Terror that started in 1918. Political enemies and dissidents were intended targets, but inspiring fear in the rest of the population was also a definite goal. By the official end of the Red Terror in 1922, at least 1 million people had been killed, though the true number could easily be higher. But just who was in charge of those deaths? Founded in 1917, the Cheka was the Bolshevik secret police force, initially meant to investigate counter-revolutionary actions. The group only grew in power, often acting as the vicious hand behind many of the darkest moments of the Red Terror. Eventually, the Cheka would become the infamous NKVD, the enforcers for Joseph Stalin's Great Terror years later. With the inception of the Red Terror and the creation of the Cheka, the Bolsheviks made clear that they were more than willing to use brutal force against those they considered political enemies. But that didn't mean civilians were safe. New Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin made it explicitly clear that being a member of the working class meant very little at the end of the day, even if the revolution was nominally for the benefits of the working and the poor. In his own words, revolutionary violence cannot be withheld from use also against wavering and irresolute elements among the working masses themselves. And that was no idle threat. On multiple occasions, workers in different parts of Russia went on strike, often protesting the generally low standard of living they were suffering through, or the arrests of anyone who opposed the Bolshevik Party in any way. The Cheka was dispatched to deal with strikers, and they typically did so violently, carrying out executions with victims that could number from a few dozen to a few thousand. Not only that, but these weren't always simple executions carried out with firearms. In one case, victims were weighed down with stones before being dumped into a river, a slow death by drowning. Russian concentration camps got their start during the Russian Revolution, run by the Cheka. For an example of those early camps, you just have to look to Kolmogorye. The region had already gone through quite a bit of turmoil. An anti-Bolshevik uprising was met with terror propagated by both sides before being soundly crushed. In retribution, cities like Kolmogorye became the first home to forced death camps. Anyone seen as a threat against the Bolshevik regime was sentenced there, whether they were former government officers or ordinary civilians in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were killed whenever the Cheka officers saw fit. Stories say that some dozen people were killed each day, whether by drowning, shooting, or several other terrible methods. While the death camp ran for only a few years, over 8,000 people disappeared, but the exact statistics of total deaths have been lost to time. The camps left a terrible legacy. The old side of the Kolmogorye camp was a reliable place for medical students in the 1930s to just dig and find bodies for study. Even in the years following, locals cleaning up or digging in the fields would often stumble across human remains. When it came to the Russian Revolution, the simultaneous waging of World War I is important to remember. Once Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to power, they drew Russia out of the war, something the rest of the Allies weren't pleased with. After all, one less combatant only made the situation better for Germany. What followed was a military and diplomatic mess called the Allied Intervention. The governments of Britain, France, and the US sent thousands of troops to Russia with the vague purpose of getting the White Army into power. But the plan was a mess from the start. Government officials in both Britain and the US couldn't agree on why they should get involved, or if they should at all, leaving commanders like US General William Graves to figure it out on their own.
General Graves and his men were to avoid any involvement in the erupting internal affairs of Russia. This presidential directive was easier issued than followed.
Some troops actively fought in the Civil War against the Bolsheviks, while some fought against their supposed white allies. One British soldier summed it up when he said, "I never really met any Russians at all or had any idea why I was there. Needless to say, the decision to meddle in Russian affairs was wildly unpopular. As World War I came to a close and 1919 rolled in, Allied troops were still fighting and dying in Russia, desperate to get home. Opposition continued to grow on all fronts, but the failed experiment wasn't fully abandoned until 1920. The Allied intervention was meant to aid the White Army, and that aid included running prison camps, including one colloquially known as Death Island. The camp itself, run by Britain and France, was confused from the onset. Some arrests even happened before the camp existed, meaning that early prisoners had to build their own prison. Aside from that, foreign soldiers didn't know the nuances of the conflict and were liable to arrest anyone who seemed suspicious, Bolshevik or not. But the macabre nickname came from the conditions inside the camp. Part of that was the active violence, executions of those who tried to flee, or ice cells left open to the harsh Russian winter, leaving prisoners with frostbite if it didn't kill them. But there was also neglect. Prisoners had to scramble for scraps of food, and diseases like typhus and scurvy spread like wildfire. Hundreds died, and the officers in charge justified the suffering, saying that it was nothing compared to the violence of the revolution overall. Death Island also had an unintended and terrible legacy. One of the prisoners would go on to become a Cheka officer infamous for running brutal northern Russian concentration camps. In 1921, the new Soviet Republic was devastated by a terrible famine. The causes behind the famine vary, one of which was decreased agricultural yield. Between World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the effects of both of those events on the tools that farmers had at their disposal, grain yield decreased by about 50%. Added to that, some massive droughts, and production itself would naturally be down. But the famine wasn't born out of entirely natural causes. On the contrary, in certain areas like Ukraine, the problem was made far worse as a result of Bolshevik policies. Ukrainian towns actually would have had enough to survive despite bad harvests, but government officials were pressured into sending food to Russia instead. But there still wasn't enough food for Russia either, with the Volga region especially hard hit. As PBS explains,
where up to 100,000 Russians were dying every week.
With over 30 million people affected by the famine, mortality was so high that corpses piled up in front of cemeteries, too numerous to be properly buried. Not only that, but starvation wasn't the only killer. Sometimes it was the harbinger of terrible, deadly disease. Perhaps worst of all, people were so hungry that they resorted to eating anything. Sometimes that meant eating dirt, but other times it actually meant cannibalism. Ultimately, it's estimated that 5 million people died during the famine. Unmoved by the ideals and promises of the Bolshevik Party and faced with famine and wanton violence, people began to fight back. Revolt officially broke out in 1920 as peasants marched on the city of Tambov, united in their anger and forming growing guerrilla groups. That drew the eye of Moscow officials, who sent forces of their own, and as the conflict dragged on, both the rebels and the Red Army began terrorizing villages. As the leadership dissolved, guerrilla groups were diminished to little more than roving bands of raiders, but Bolshevik forces took things even further. The lines between active rebels and innocent civilians began to blur, and attempts to crush rebellions became ever more brutal. Village populations were arrested to make a statement and incite fear. Families of known rebels were treated like bargaining chips. They were thrown into concentration camps as a way to bait out those rebels, even though the families were themselves innocent. And of course, there were also deaths. Mass executions were threatened on multiple occasions, and poison gas was dumped into the forest that hid rebel camps, a tactic that had never been used on civilian populations. The Russian Revolution was rife with widespread systematic violence and repression, and there's evidence suggesting that Vladimir Lenin himself intended that. But Lenin likely wasn't the only one to sow chaos, because behind the scenes, Lenin's strings were being pulled by Germany. Why? Well, the Russian Revolution led to Russia pulling out of World War I. The move gave the Germans a huge tactical advantage, as it meant they no longer had to defend their eastern front and could instead focus on defeating the remaining allies in the west. Germany facilitated it all by arranging for Lenin's return to Russia in 1917 after a decade in exile. It wasn't easy. Germany gave Lenin and his circle passage to Russia in a secure train car, correctly predicting that the chaos Lenin sowed would lead to Russia's withdrawal from the war. Historian Edward Crankshaw suggested that while Germany saw Lenin as a mere fanatic, they hoped he would be able to spread infection and destabilize Russia. To that end, the Germans also funded the Bolshevik Revolution, a move that, given what happened when the nations faced off 2 decades later in World War II, may have ultimately backfired. When you look through history, anti-Semitism is a terrible, continuous trend. It was already present in Russia before the revolution, as widespread pogroms, violent massacres of Jewish communities, began under the Romanovs. But during the Russian Revolution, the anti-Semitic myth of Judeo-Bolshevism began to spread, especially among the White Army under Anton Denikin. As the BBC put it,
considering anti-Semitism a creative force for national unity, Denikin permitted the extermination of Jews in the Ukraine.
In a nutshell, Judeo-Bolshevism was a widely circulated lie that Jewish communities were behind the Bolshevik Revolution, and that said revolution was the first step to effective world domination. This disinformation was heavily rooted in a lot of harmful stereotypes, but no actual fact. And regardless, the White Army began to use it as justification for the widespread murders of Jewish communities. They claimed that this ethnic genocide was simply in pursuit of peace and stability, and necessary to put an end to the Bolshevik threat under Russia. Unfortunately, this propaganda caught on, and the atrocities committed by the White Army are staggering. In Ukraine alone, entire towns were massacred and looted en masse, with victims numbering from a few hundred to a few thousand in each separate instance. On the whole, between 1918 and 1922, Jewish victims in Ukraine and Belarus numbered around 150,000. Perhaps even darker, though, was the long-term effect that such a belief had, namely when it came to World War II. Adolf Hitler found Judeo-Bolshevism to be an effective weapon in his propaganda campaign to vilify Jewish communities and attempt to legitimize the Nazi regime and their pursuit of the Holocaust.